In this video, I need to repair this hole. I put it in the wrong spot. I was gonna put my thermostat over there. Didn't like it. So I need to fill it. This hole is too big to not put some sort of tape or something on, but it's too small that it needs to be cut out and patched with some backing or to do a hot patch or anything like that. So what we're gonna need to do is put some tape on it and some drywall compound. Now you can't use the regular drywall compound when you do this. You want to use a fast setting drywall compound. So a fast set, I use sheetrock 20, but there's lots of different brands. Basically it's got a set. So the time that is on the bag, you got 20, 45, and 90 is how long it's going to take to set. So a small patch like this, you can get away with 20. Now you can even get a 5-minute mud. It comes in a small bag. You can get all of them in a small bag, but the 5-minute mud comes in a small bag. Now, 5-minute and 20-minute, there's really not much of a difference, even though it says it is. I think for the value of the money, just buy a big bag of 20, use what you need of it, and then set it aside for the next time somebody pops a hole somewhere or you need to patch something. So, bag of 20 for stuff like this, even 45 if you want to take your time. And the next thing is going to be what tape is best for this. This is your standard paper tape. When in doubt, just use paper tape. It's the tried and true original tape. The issue with this, especially for beginners, is if you don't get the mud to the right consistency, you need to be a little bit more, need the drywall mud to be a little bit on the thin side for the tape to actually stick. Get you a nice fresh piece. So this stuff is good. It's a little bit thicker, so sometimes you have to build it out. For a patch like this, this is almost not quite big enough, but it would work in this case. So you probably find, rip off a piece just a little bit bigger, use some scissors, patch that over, and that's going to work great. The only issue is that I like to fill this hole with a little bit thicker mud, so you almost need to pre-fill this and then set the tape on with a nice thin down sheetrock 20. So mix up a little bit thicker, fill that, wipe it off smooth with your knife, put a little bit of wet mud on here. After that's set, put this on, take that leftover, cover it up. That's your first coat, and then you let that dry and you can do your second coat. So that's one great way to do it. Now, another popular method is to use this fiber tape. So this is like the handyman's secret weapon. You got duct tape and you got fiber tape. So the fiber tape, same thing, you can stick it on, which is nice, but you don't have to do the pre-fill. So you can take a little bit thicker, fast setting mud, put that over there for your first coat. So you've saved a step of pre-filling. You can pre-fill into your first coat at the same time. And this stuff works really well. I find the problem with this is you get a little bit of lift off. The first coat I find I need to put on very tight just to hold it in place, and then you can do your next coat. The other problem is this stuff has a tendency to crack. So if you don't get this really good and solid, you may have a crack. This also, it's okay for this size of hole because it does cover both sides. About a ½ inch, which is about the minimum you'd want to do, but there is another tape you can use. Get this off here. So this tape is called Fibofuse. Now it's kind of a combination of paper tape and fiber tape. The nice thing with this stuff is I find it a little bit stronger, but it's also very thin. So when you're doing patches, you don't have to build out as much. You also don't have to be concerned about pre-filling. If you don't get enough mud underneath this, when you do the next coat, it will soak through and help adhere the tape on in place. So what I like to buy for patches is this big wide stuff. So this is a 6-inch Fibofuse tape. What I can do is just cut the size I want and install the Fibofuse on the wall that way. This works really great if you have like a rough area, if you're going plaster to drywall or anything like that. You can go a little bit wider, which is going to help with cracking. And again, whatever tape you use doesn't really matter. It's just you need to have tape on here, and you need to use a fast setting mud, or you need to at least pre-fill pre-fill with a fast setting mud if you're using paper tape. Once you've pre-filled, then you can use a regular compound with the paper tape. Now if you use when you're using this fiber tape, you need to use hot set mud for your first coat, which is great. So you can pre-fill and first coat with your hot set mud. That saves you a step, and then you can do the rest with your regular compound, which is easier to sand, and it's a little bit more forgiving, but it's going to take a little bit longer to dry. In this case, I'm going to use the fiber fuse. Again, I like this fiber fuse because it's nice and thin, so you don't have to build out. The thicker you make your patch, the wider you have to go. So when you use paper tape, especially if you need two pieces on here, say this hole's a little bit bigger and you need two pieces and you need to overlap, that's just building everything out, and then you need to build out wider. So if you want to do this fast, you need to do less build out and keep everything small. So what I'm going to do is, now you can also get this fiber tape in 6 inches, which would work as well. I just find I'm using this less and less and kind of replacing it with the fiber fuse. I just find this a little bit thinner, a little bit easier to work with, but everybody's got their own preference. So there's nothing wrong with any of them, it's just personal preference. Now to get started, I'm just gonna cut a little bit of this fiber tape. You can also buy the kits that go on. They have like they have a tape on them. They adhere on there. They have like a metal mesh in them, and then you just tape over that. But they're like, you know, $5. So you can buy a small roll of tape for less, and you can do a whole bunch of patches for less money. But they do work. So we're gonna make our own basically. So what I'm gonna do is just cut the size I need. Now this stuff, you get these little fiberglass, you get some fiberglass flaking off there. So if you're gonna be cutting a lot of this, you'll wanna wear a mask and you might get a little bit itchy. And I'm just gonna cut it this way. Okay. Now I have a good sized patch, coverage. You know, I'm about 1 inch all the way around. Perfect. So I'm gonna set that aside. I'm gonna mix up my hot set mud. Okay, when you're fixing up the hot set mud, I like to put a little bit in the mud pan. This might be a little more than I need, but it's better to err on having too much and throw a little bit away than it is to run out and have to, you know, you want to have a little bit more mud than you need. Now I start with the dry and slowly add water. If you add the dry to the wet, you'll find that you get a bunch of clumping. You want to mix it a little bit dry and slowly wet it down as needed. Now, like I said earlier, so you want to start with a little bit thicker coating when you're using this fiber fuse. It's okay to be just a touch thick, but because you want to fix this. You don't want it so runny that it just falls through the hole, but you don't want it so thick that your drywall tape isn't going to stick. So trying to find that balance, but I just keep adding a little bit of water, mix it up, add a little bit of water. If you think you got too much water, you can dump a little bit off right away, but again, you want to avoid clumping. There, you have a nice consistent amount. Okay, it's kind of thick, kind of stays, but it's right. So I use a small knife to mix it. Then I use a little bit bigger taping knife. This is a 4-inch taping knife. And what I want to do is make sure I got this all packed into this hole really well. So that should be good. You don't need, you know, a ton. You just want to make sure that hole's filled. Now, what I want to do is get about 1/8 of an inch everywhere else and set the tape. Make sure you have it centered. I can see where it is. Now the thing with this fiber fuse is it will tear a lot easier than the other tape. So you don't want to squish it out so much that you're going to tear the tape, and you want to hold your knife really flat. Okay, just kind of get it set. Now you can take off some of this excess stuff, wipe it into your pan. Now, this is pretty thick, so it's going to be tougher to get out. If you have a little bit more runny mud, it's going to be easier. But again, you just kind of hold your knife flat. Try and get some of the excess out of there so that you're not building it up too much without ripping it. So that's pretty good there. So if you want to leave that, you can actually leave that the way it is, and it's going to shrink up and suck that in really dry if you've got the time. I never seem to have the time. So I'm going to take some of my mud and just do a nice first coat. Now you can use a little bit bigger knife, but you're just trying to get things kind of covered up. And you'll notice right away that this thing will kind of come through, and that's okay. All you're trying to do with this first coat is fill in around the edges so that the tape and everything is nice and flat, and you're not concerned about getting things perfect. You want to use your knife and apply pressure on the area where there is no mud, right around here. Apply pressure, and that's good. So we're just going to leave that set for a little while. I don't have any high spots, but we're going to let it sit for a little while. If I have any high spots, I'll scrape them off or rub them in depending on how the mud sets, and then the rest of this is garbage. I mix up way too much. But I got a few other spots in the house I need to touch up, so I'll run around and do that. Now if you have some lift-offs or some lines, what you can do before it's fully set is you can actually go through and tool it a little bit while it's still a little bit workable. Now mine's pretty good, so I don't need to do it, but you can actually clean it up a little bit more, so you don't have to sand as much. That's kind of the key to this, is less sanding, get the mud on, do a good job, just a quick sand at the end, and patch it up, and your parents didn't know you had a big party and put the door through the wall. Now you can use a fan or something to help this dry a little bit. You can also use a heat gun, but the problem with the heat gun is it's just going to dry the outside and the underside is going to stay wet. And what I find is that it'll start to peel off the drywall. You're not going to get as nice of a bond. Also, if you have a bit of a shiny wall, you'll want to, like if you have a semi-gloss or even a gloss paint, I've seen that in houses, you're going to want to sand that not so much off, but just to get rid of the shine. You can also add a little bit of glue to the water that you're mixing with your mud. So you can take a bottle of water, squirt a little bit of wood glue in there, just shake it up and then add it in, and that's going to add some extra glue to adhere your mud to the wall. But you're going to find with that extra glue, it's going to be harder to sand. I've never had a real problem with it, but what you want to do is do thin coats and let each coat dry very well. So you're going to have to probably wait about an hour between each one before you hit it the next time. But it's also going to depend on the humidity in the air and whether you have air conditioning on or heat or what's going on in your house, how much air movement you have. It's going to affect the dry time. So basically you want this whole thing, as you can see, is kind of white around the outside. The whole thing should be that without any gray. It doesn't have to be completely dry. It doesn't have to be so dry that you can sand it, because you're not going to sand between coats. But you need it dry enough that when you put the next coat on, that it's going to break the bond. Okay, so let this get good and dry now. You just want to feel it, see kind of how it's feeling, where it's humped up, and if you have any high spots, you can take your knife and just scrape them off. You shouldn't need to sand, but if you really laid it on, you might want to sand. What you'd want is just keep this consistent. So I'm going to mix up some more of this hot mud. Again, you want a little bit more than you think you're going to need. It's better to throw some extra away. You want to mix it up on the dry side and add water so it doesn't clump.
Okay, so in this case, I have a quantity one here. So when I take this, I can cheat a little bit. I can go start up, and this is a really quantity. So my goal is a quantity supply. So if I want to make, I'm probably going to do more coat, and if I want to touch me, the chance to fish. So
first thing, a little bit of mud on a knife, knock it on the corners, so I can miss, and then get some mud out. Once you get down, get some mud on the outside. I'll get the outside, try to get mud on the wall first. So I go, now I get mud on the wall, I'm trying to clean out the coat. So normally, if it's a big area, I'm going to one side, pressure on the side of my knife, and then the other side, just expand this little joint, or this little patch. Slowly just kind of work it out. Like that. So my patch is here, just on the top of it, on the bottom. Pressure up. That's good. What do you want to make it here? I go to the top, that's what you do the same on the top. I'm going to use my patch for this. Now, it's not too much. That's it. Now, you know that's right. Say how you want to try to get the top, get it up. It's not what's happening on the wall. It's going to try on the side. You the side. You know, you have to try to save the coat. Not on the wall. Inside is right. So one of the right to be. We're trying to patch. Pushing it, pushing it, pushing it, and pushing it. In this case, we're nice coat. Here we fish eyes. So that needs a little thicker area. And this will probably get so much. We're going to try. See what's like. We're going to dry. Might go to fish eyes. These holes back in. Might get it back. Or something I do. Let's just splash up. Let it dry. And if it's some toast, it's animal. I'm just let's try to go on the dry. It's all if I do so, it's 5 centimeters. Let's ready to go. So in this case, I have a corner bead going here. So when I tape this, I can cheat a little bit. I don't have to go as far out. And then this is already a little bit concave, so my hole is in a concave spot. So it's kind of a bonus for me. I can probably get away with just doing one more coat and with a little bit of touch-ups when we get into showing some fish eyes. So first thing, I just want to get a little bit of mud on my knife. I like to knock off the corners so I'm not making a mess. And then get some mud on. Now, if I go straight down, I might get some mud falling off the outside. It all depends on how we do it. It's not really, we're not doing high production stuff, so you're just trying to get the mud on the wall at first. So I'm gonna go down a little bit, that's a good amount. Take off the extra. So now I got the mud on the wall, I wanna try and clean it up a bit and get an even coat. So normally, if it's in a big area, I'm gonna go down one side and keep the pressure on the left side of my knife and then the other side. But in this case, I can basically span this whole joint or this whole patch. So slowly just kind of work it out. Like that. So my patch is in here. I could use a little bit more mud on the top of it, a little heavy on the bottom. Extra up. That's pretty good. And what I can do is run my knife, like I said, have the pressure here. I get a little bit of a lift off, but that's no big deal. And you can do the same at the bottom and the top. I don't really need to. My patch is looking pretty good. Now I'm just playing with it too much. That's it. So now you're gonna let that dry for a little while. Again, a fan will help, but you don't want it to dry too fast because it could lift off, like it could peel up, because it's not. What's happening when you have a painted wall is it can only dry on one side. So if you use a heat gun on this, it's going to dry on this side and stay wet on the inside. So you hit it with a heat gun, feels dry, you go to sand it, do another coat, and all of a sudden it's falling off the wall and you can't figure out why, is because on the inside it's actually still wet. So the longer you let this dry, the better it's going to be. But again, we're trying to do a quick patch, so we're kind of pushing the limits. And sometimes when you push the limits, it ends up costing you more time. So in this case, we're pretty good. We've got a nice even coat. In here, we're getting some fish eyes. So that means it's a little bit thicker in that area, and it's nice and thin on the outside. So this coat would probably be okay if I didn't have these bubbles. Some of them might actually go away a little bit. We're gonna let this dry, see what it looks like. We're gonna come back in a little bit, keep our eye on it. We might be able to work these fish eyes, these little holes back in, and it might be okay, and we might just be able to get it with some spackling, or we just do another thin coat. Now sometimes what I do is I'll just hit this, let this flash up, let this get dry, and then if it's at somebody's house and it's late in the day and I want to go home, I'm just gonna let this dry up enough that I can do a coat, but I'm gonna use drywall compound and let that dry overnight, because it dries slow and the mud's gonna dry slow with that extra coating on it. And then if I have a good base coat and it's nice and flat and it doesn't need sanding, then I just give it a light sand and we're ready to go. Now, if you've done a poor job underneath and you got some high spots and it's not great, and then you put the compound on and you try to sand, you may sand through, and the 20 and the compound, they're gonna be a little bit different The 20 is going to be a little bit harder to sand than this compound, so then you're going to have issues sanding it, and it might cause you more problems than you want. You may as well stick with 20 if you're not going to do a good job on the underside coats. So, or the opposite is what I did was set the tape in there, hit it with compound, let that dry, but it's going to take about 24 hours. Maybe you get lucky if it does it overnight, and then you get to hit it again. It depends how thick you put it on, the temperature, the humidity, and a bunch of different factors. And usually when it's on paint, it dries a little bit slower because again, it's got to dry on the one side. So in this case, we're going to let it dry and we're going to see where it's at in a few minutes. Okay, so I've let this dry overnight. Normally with sheetrock 20, I would just, once this is set up, I'd throw a coat of either 20 on it or a coat of just regular compound. I'd just scrape off the high spots, throw some compound on it, let it dry overnight. It might not be dry, it might take a little bit longer, so if it's a job, I'd probably come back at the end of the day or plan. Even with the 20 and the compound, it's just so wet that it just doesn't want to dry. So if you have the time, or depending on your situation, if you can let everything dry really good, you can see it's still a little bit gray in here, but it's just mainly the thickness. It's pretty dry, it's not 100%, but it's good enough to sand. So if you want a better finish and you want less sanding, you sand this coat, and we're going to put a nice thin coat over top. That's going to take away all the last little bits of defects, and it's going to be really easy to sand after that. So it just depends on your situation, if you're doing, how much time you have. When you're doing these types of patches, it's always best to use a compound like sheetrock 20 or 40, 45, a fast setting compound drywall mud, because the pre-mixed compounds just don't dry. They just stay wet, and if it's too thick, it's going to take forever. So if I did this with compound, this would be soaking wet still. So now with the 20, I can sand it the next day, and I can do another thin coat. That's going to dry within a couple hours, no problem, even if you use just compound. I don't have any compound here, so I'm going to use the 20, but using a fast set mud that's your best option for doing patches or anything that's thick, that's over, that isn't just finishing. Now when you're doing new drywall and you got a whole house to do, compound's great. The pre-mixed stuff that you buy in the boxes or the big buckets, that's great because you have lots of time for it to dry. It's going to dry faster because it's going to soak into the drywall as it dries. In this case, when you're dealing with paints and you're only doing one patch, you want to get this done fast, the 20s or the hot set muds, the fast setting compounds, that's the way to go, the mixing type compounds. And get used to using them, and they're going to be a great asset. They're going to be a great product for doing all sorts of patches. You're going to get a better finish, and you don't have to wait 3 days for stuff to dry. So we're going to sand this. That's okay. You can make sure the high spot rating you focus a little bit. You really want to make sure that's what you're going to see, like, so then you're going to get so much. So overall, that's pretty good. So I feel like you don't speak, so fine. Well, this is more than fine. The last skin coat really looking at this perfect patch. So let's start on that. You get a little bit of 20, so you get a couple of hours, and we'll do the rest. So that's pretty good. Keep feeling to make sure there's no high spots or anything, and you can focus a little bit of the sanding. You really want to make sure you get these edges. That's what you're going to see. The light hits those edges. So when you do your next coat, you're not building up these edges too much. So overall, that's pretty good. Besides a few little blemishes, you could almost just paint this and it'd be fine. For what I see in a lot of places, this is more than fine. But the last skim coat is really what's going to make this a perfect patch. So let's get started on that. I'm going to mix up a little bit more sheetrock 20. You've seen me do it a couple times already, so I'm not going to show you this time. I'm just going to get it ready and we'll do our last coat. Okay, I'm all ready. I'd mix this up a little bit thinner just so I can get a nice smooth finish, I'm gonna use a little bit smaller knife, and then I'll finish it off with a larger knife. It's just hard to get out of the pan when you only have a little bit of mud with that big knife. So I'm just gonna get it on. Do as much as I can with this knife. Applying pressure on this side of the knife. That kind of smooths it out. Down here, down here. I use a bigger knife just to kind of, oh yeah. So as you can see, I'm getting some fish eyes. Not much I can do to avoid it. I'm gonna have to touch it up with a little spackling or something. Up in there. Applying pressure on the outside. Oops. That's about as good as you're going to get with sheetrock 20. It doesn't smooth out as nice as the compound does. So that's good. We're gonna let that dry, and if I gotta touch this up, I'm just gonna use a little spackling. Unfortunately, when you're putting mud over paint, you're always gonna get some fish eyes. And what you can do again is these thin coats can help, but even that, I just find quick with the spackling, fills them in, no problem. Try not to worry about it too much, but overall, this is gonna be a nice patch. Okay, so this is good and dry, nice and smooth. It's just gonna need some minor sanding to get it done. So you wanna get this good, dry. You can usually feel if it's not cold anymore. You don't wanna go too early, because what'll happen is you'll kind of sand into the wet stuff and you'll mess everything up, and then you'll have to put another touch-up coat. If you do have any fish eyes or anything, I might have a couple up here. We'll see how it sands up. You're gonna hit those. Usually I hit those after I prime. I'll just, when you go through and do a bunch of touch-ups, hit it with some spackling that dries fast, and that's usually the easiest part. If there's a lot of fish eyes, you'll wanna just do a really thin skim coat again with some drywall compound or hot mud, and that usually dries super fast because it's really thin. But the key is you want to have this good and dry, because you don't want any issues with sanding. You also don't want to sand the top layer, paint this, and then it dries, and then over time it shrinks up a little bit, and then you might see some of the shrinkage. So once it's good and all the water's out and it's shrunk and everything's solid, you just need to sand it. Now you want to sand, I'm going to use a sanding sponge. You almost want to use the bigger sand poles. Anything bigger is better, so that you get a nice flat sanding surface. When I use a small sanding sponge, you want to have long strokes. You don't want to focus on one area because you'll get dips and everything. You also don't want to use just regular sandpaper with no backing on it. You want to have it at least on a block. So the key with this is you don't want to over sand. If you think you're over sanding, you just stop, put another thin coat on there. It will dry pretty quick, but in this case, I barely need to sand any of this. Mainly just around the edges, so you don't see any of the edge marks from the smooth area. Mainly for me, I need to just sand around the edges, and just to kind of, I have a little bit of a lift off here, but just some light sanding and I'm done. So that's when you know you've done a good job, is there's very limited sanding. So let's give this a sand. You might want to wear a dust mask or something. Again, I'm not doing much sanding. I'm going to suck up all the dust with this with my vacuum and do it all at once. There you go. Nice smooth patch. You might want to take like a bright light and shine it on there, but you can usually feel anything. Bright treble light kind of on an angle. I can use my camera light to kind of see if there's any marks. Overall looks pretty good. I got a few lines in there, so I'll just sand a little bit more. So that's about it. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.